Hi there and welcome. In recent weeks I have expressed some fairly unequivocal opinions on James Goss. That being the case, it seems only fair and perhaps prudent to subject the belief I have formed about him, based on my increasing knowledge of what actually took place during Miss Letby's trial, to the sternest examination readily available to me. I see no more reasonable opportunity I could furnish to him to prove me wrong than to fully acquaint myself with his directions to the jurors at the end of the trial and his summing up of the evidence heard in general. On that basis, having encountered a report of his summing up while researching my last but one video, I decided that it was only right to do a deep dive on it, even if the prospect filled me with the same revulsion as that scene in the film Trainspotting when Ewan McGregor is obliged to go fishing down inside a toilet he had just filled for those evacuated suppositories. Having now gone through the judge's 5+ days of summing up and legal direction to the jurors, the most charitable speculation I can make is that perhaps Miss Letby was just unfortunate enough to bear a particularly striking resemblance to some girl or woman who did James Goss a grievous wrong in his youth, a wrong which he has never forgiven, forgotten, or otherwise recovered from psychologically. I say charitable because in that scenario there would at least be an understandable, though no less deplorable, human explanation for the indefatigable effort on his part to see her rot in prison, which is my main takeaway from his summing up. There is hatred there. Perhaps he simply needed to make himself feel that way in order to carry out an unpalatable assignment. But whatever the reason, the hatred is palpable. It is a cold, implacable hatred, which can be gleaned from his missing no opportunity, however petty, to call into question Miss Letby's reliability as a witness. It is apparent in the relentless and twisted way he exploits every weakness of the undeveloped intellect he has become aware of over a lifetime as a legal professional to bury her in the minds of the jurors. And most of all, it is there in coded instructions to the jurors to convict her. The whole thing is a sinister masterclass in the clinically selective use of information to mislead. Even the BBC could learn from him. Judith Moritz evidently did. Might the explanation simply be that he thought she was guilty? Well, yes and no. In the first place, I remain convinced that no person of even average intelligence could, after a couple of hours committed study to the case, be satisfied that Miss Letby attacked any babies. Also, don't just walk into the respect for authority trap we are conditioned to default to in circumstances like these by tamely shutting down your critical faculty with the thought, well, he probably might obviously know something we don't. James Goss would have got the same file that Cheshire Constabulary sent to the CPS for approval to charge, plus details of any amendments the CPS made and why. The evidence would be identical with what the police sent through to the CPS. The CPS receives and assesses evidence. It does not gather evidence. If Operation Hummingbird had more incriminating evidence against Miss Letby, it would have formed part of the case sent to the CPS. This was a criminal case, not a military or MI6 operation coming within the ambit of the Official Secrets Act. The only possible information Goss might exclusively have is definitive information of a formal decision to frame Miss Letby. I'm not committing to that because of the possibility of a more mundane and therefore probable explanation. That explanation being low-level bureaucratic evil to start things off, essentially the consultants regressing to the conduct of little boys gone feral, then bureaucratic inertia once the whole thing got going. By that inertia, I mean the bureaucratic equivalent of the principle expressed by Newton's first law of motion, that a body, once in motion, will continue in that state unless acted upon by something sufficiently powerful. Our campaign, in Miss Letby's case, hopefully. If we allow Goss to be the exception that proves the rule by being the intelligent person who could even scratch the surface of this case and still believe Miss Letby guilty, there is the further, and in my opinion, stronger consideration of professional pride. Professional pride would tend to militate against the belief in Miss Letby's guilt, giving rise to the animus against her so apparent in his leaving no stone unturned in securing her conviction. In my experience, for any professional, the ultimate failure is to get sucked in. A professional facing that prospect generally becomes even more scrupulous in their responsibilities in order to be quite certain afterwards that they did not allow personal feelings to play a role in the discharging of their office. An honestly held belief that Miss Letby was a serial murderer would more motivate a highly trained, hugely experienced professional in the twilight of life to take the view that the facts of the case could be relied upon and left to their own devices to establish that guilt without artificial support, with the emphasis being very much on artifice. No one makes it into the upper echelons of any profession by talent alone. When status is achieved through hard work, a professional pride in that role comes naturally. James Goss is necessarily of intelligence, but my impression is that he is not astoundingly so. He would have had to work hard to get where he is. Goss began his summing up on June 15th, taking the best part of a day, then picked it up again on July the 3rd, after the closing statements of both prosecution and defense. His summing up then ran for the entirety of what was a 4-day week, concluding before lunch the following Monday. The very first thing he does is give the jurors a direction that they should decide the case solely on the evidence placed before them. That sounds reasonable enough, and in a fair trial, in the sense that all available evidence was put to the jurors, it obviously would be. As all should be aware, he had excluded from the trial the strongest defense evidence, the RCPCH report, and the all-important details of Miss Letby's grievance. In doing that, he premised the trial on a version of reality which is a lie. What this direction therefore amounts to is this: even if you jurors have somehow come to learn the true reality that health issues and poor clinical practice more readily explains the deaths and collapses than murder, you are not allowed to factor that information into your decision. Basically, you can only go in the direction in which I have guided you. The next thing he tells them is equally innocuous sounding at first sight, but almost as pernicious to both Miss Letby and justice itself. Hiding this evil behind his most avuncular voice and facial expression, I'm sure, he tells the jurors that it is not their role to resolve every conflict in the evidence. This brings to mind the story of legendary Liverpool manager Bill Shankly's response to a referee who told him that a goal was allowed to stand because the opposition player in an offside position had not been interfering with play. If he's not interfering with play, what's he doing on the pitch? If sitting in judgment on a person is not about resolving conflicts in evidence, then what exactly is it about? I don't think I would be going too far if I said it was just about the core responsibility of a jury. With this instruction, he is giving jurors a license to effectively shoot from the hip in making their calls on the case. Reasonable doubt is the wholly legitimate child of the coming together of some conflict in evidence and the designated role of the jury, that of evaluating evidence against the defendant. This direction therefore transparently lowers the burden of proof on the prosecution. In facilitating the task of the prosecution in that way, it necessarily waters down the principle of the defendant not being obliged to prove anything to the court. The defendant is meant to enter court with the ready-made shield of innocent until proven guilty. The prosecution's task is to fashion a sword from the evidence capable of hacking away that shield to leave the defendant exposed. A conflict in the evidence amounts to a flaw in the prosecution's sword, analogous to a flaw in the material or workmanship of a real sword, which leaves it liable to breaking in two the first time it is swung at a shield in anger. Goss's next legal direction is one which, when put in context of his reason given for ruling the RCPCH report inadmissible, gives arguably the most vivid impression of his bias against Miss Letby. Having a few minutes earlier told the jurors that if they are sure that someone on the unit was deliberately harming babies, they did not have to be sure of the precise harm. In itself, both a nonsense and a nasty appeal legitimizing malice if you stop to think about it. He then returns to the subject to personalize things, and then take them one step further. I quote, "If you are satisfied so that you are sure in the case of any baby that they were deliberately harmed by the defendant, then you are entitled to consider how likely it is that other babies in the case who suffered unexpected collapses did so as a result of some unexplained or natural cause rather than as a consequence of some deliberate harmful act by someone." End quote. As explained in my last but one video, he ruled the RCPCH report inadmissible because its damning conclusions were general only and did not directly address any individual count on the indictment. Closing his mind to the obvious fact that the findings of any service review are by definition relevant to every instance of the delivery of that service during the relevant period, his emperor holding court stark naked position was that it was illegitimate to draw inference on any of the 22 individual counts from a general state of affairs. He refused to allow the defense to read down from the general to the particular. The logic behind that ruling is really a bit like saying that psychoanalysis is pointless with people from China, India, or even Scotland, because none of the patients on whose case studies Freud developed his theory of the unconscious mind were from those countries. Here, in his summing up, on the other hand, he is directing the jurors that if they find deliberate harm in any particular case on the indictment, it is then permissible to approach and view all remaining 21 counts on the indictment through the lens of their belief that deliberate harm has occurred in that single case. He is authorizing the jurors to read from the particular case up to the totality of the whole indictment, the general. A direction which greatly facilitates the prosecution case, whereas he refused the more natural inference to be made from the general state of the unit to the particular collapses, something which the defense had naturally expected to be able to argue. This is not flawed logic or reasoning on Goss's part. It is something infinitely worse for someone in his role, because it is sophistry. False, fake, disingenuous reasoning calculated to pervert the course of justice. For the avoidance of doubt, this is what he says next. If you conclude that this is I quote, I'll start again. This is what he says next. I quote, if you conclude that this is unlikely, this being that other collapses could still have an explanation unrelated to crime, then you could, if you think it right, treat the evidence of that event and any others, if any, which you find were a consequence of a deliberately harmful act, as supporting evidence in the cases of other babies, and that the defendant was the person responsible. End quote. The jurors are therefore encouraged to make a logically tenuous inference to Miss Letby's detriment, but not given the opportunity to make a more natural, actually obvious one to her advantage. Goss then says the following, I quote, when deciding how far, if at all, the evidence in relation to any of the cases supports the case against the defendant on any other or others, you should take into account how similar or dissimilar, in your opinion, the allegations and the circumstances of and surrounding their collapses are. End quote. As stated, this was the direction given to jurors on June 15th. Compare and contrast it with the following words from Monday, July 10th, in the final minutes of his marathon 5+ days of summing up. I quote the report. He says there were certain common, he being Goss, there were certain common features among the cases, that the defendant was on duty for each event. He refers to the note that Nicholas Johnson KC had referred to, which was a list that included that 5 babies had unusual bleeding, 8 had discoloration. The defendant said that she did not see discoloration, or there was no discoloration to be seen. 5 babies collapsed within moments of a nurse going on break. 4 babies were screaming / crying uncharacteristically. 4 babies recovered after being taken to another hospital. 3 cases were where Letby was accused of behaving inappropriately after the baby passed away, accused by them, nothing at the time. The prosecution says these are not unconnected events and say the insulin, air embolus, and post-mortem findings can make the jury sure of Letby's guilt. End report quote. These are among his last words to the jury before they go out to begin their deliberations. As a by the way, note that they include that egregious misrepresentation of the truth on the post-mortems. 5 of the 6 that were done incontrovertibly exonerate Miss Letby. End of story. The result of the other post-mortem, cause of death unascertained, is the conclusion apparently of approximately half of neonate post-mortems, meaning that even from the prosecution's perspective, it can be seen as no more than neutral to their case, even on the most generous interpretation of it. The absent post-mortem, Charlie, was only absent at the behest of one of Miss Letby's eventual consultant accusers. The appropriate direction on the post-mortems should have been something along these lines. You must balance any opinion you have formed of deliberate harm on the part of the defendant with the knowledge that in 6 of the murder counts, a finding of guilt will involve overturning a post-mortem result where a second post-mortem has not taken place. Tell me this is not so. Instead, we get the regurgitation by the judge of a brazen prosecution lie. That needed calling out, as does the sly insinuation slipped in that Miss Letby was trying to hide her air embolism handiwork by pretending to not notice the now known to be wholly fictitious telltale discoloration. A discoloration the prosecution witnesses, by and large, only recalled years after the events, despite being, in general, comically foggy in their other recollections. To come to my point of presenting the 2 quotes, the one from June the 15th and the one from the very final couple of minutes of his summing up 3 weeks later, noting that in those closing sentences, this man, I'll start again. To come to my point in presenting the 2 quotes, note that in those closing sentences, this man is essentially just bookending the direction he gave to the jurors more than 3 weeks before, but he does so in stronger terms, much stronger terms. On June 15th, he spoke to them in relation to similarities and dissimilarities they might form an opinion on. Now he is giving those jurors their opinion in no uncertain terms. Compare the differences in tone. It is as if he somehow became more certain of the fact of similarities over the 3-week period. But how is that possible? How could he, as the judge, now have a new opinion or perception? In that time, he has heard no new evidence, only a summarizing by both sides of what each had argued to the jurors since the previous October. New evidence cannot be introduced into a closing statement. No matter how powerful and pertinent, procedural rules would oblige the judge in that circumstance to explicitly tell jurors to disregard any such new evidence. It has missed the boat. The evidence on which Goss's June 15th direction is premised is therefore exactly the same evidence on which those closing sentences of his summing up is premised. What he said to the jurors on June 15th on similarities was simply the setup for the payoff in his mini psyop to be delivered on July 10th. At the point, the content of that payoff will maximally benefit from a recency bias. My original intention had been to cover the 5+ days of content in James Goss's summing up in just one video, 2-hour push. I now feel it is too important to seek to properly engage with in under an hour. I'm therefore looking at the next 2 videos also being on the judge's summing up as well, possibly the next 3. I will seek to be comprehensive in my description video content summaries in order that you are able to dip in and dip out in an informed way. I will conclude this particular video by highlighting some other content of Goss's instructions of June 15th. That being what he says about the dodgy chart, the way he skates over the required link for causation in the burden of proof on the prosecution to secure a murder conviction, and what he says to the jurors about motive. The next video will pick things up on July 3rd, the first day of summing up after the closing statements. Goss, on June 15th, spoke of circumstantial evidence and the unlikelihood of coincidence, asserting that the prosecution relies substantially, but not wholly, on circumstantial evidence. At the commencement of his opening statement, Ben Myers had warned jurors against accepting what he described as the prosecution's theory of guilt. And further, I quote, "It is a theory built firmly on coincidence." End quote. In that statement, Ben Myers had laid down a marker, staking out a position. Goss's statement about the unlikelihood of coincidence therefore directly challenges that. What is striking about it is that he does not put it in the mouth of the prosecution, the standard formulation which he correctly adheres to elsewhere in his summing up. In effect, he is signaling to the jurors that his rejection of the defense's position, that said rejection of the defense's position is coming from him, the judge. He then goes on to make an allusion which can only be to the death chart, although he does not explicitly say so. I quote, "The defendant was the only member of the nursing and clinical staff who was on duty each time that the collapses of all the babies occurred and had associations with them at material times, either being the designated nurse or working in the unit." End quote. This statement by the judge is quite remarkable given the robustness of Ben Myers' well-founded challenge to the statistical validity of that table chart, whatever you want to call it, the famous, infamous one, in his opening statement. I quote, this is what Ben Myers had to say. "This table exists because the prosecution created it and was put together for the purpose of the prosecution. This is a self-serving document. What we have here is because the prosecution have chosen to present it this way. The chart does not show other collapses or desaturations for the children when Letby is not present." End quote. The prosecution did not and could not rebut that challenge. The only state of affairs in which Goss could conceivably have been within his rights as judge to disregard Myers' demolishing of the statistical validity of the chart would be if the prosecution had put a statistician on the stand to endorse it. That didn't happen, but Goss nonetheless directs the jurors to treat the chart/table as gospel truth. How much more outrageous can this trial get? Causation. My pick as the most technical and difficult point to prove to get to a guilty verdict in a murder trial is, by this judge, dealt with in just 9 words in giving his legal direction to his jurors. This is directly after telling jurors that once they decide someone is doing harm, they do not have to worry about exactly how. I quote, "To find the defendant guilty, however, you must be sure that she deliberately did some harmful act, and the act or acts was accompanied by the intent, and in the case of murder, was causative of death." End quote. Would even an audience of first-year law students glean the necessary working knowledge of the principle of causation from that? I'm not sure. I think you could stop 1,000 people in the street and not get a single affirmative response to the question, "Have you ever used the word causative in your life?" I therefore think Goss skates over the need to establish causation with legalese, leaving the jurors without a full appreciation of it as the last but most formidable hurdle to a murder conviction in a case built on circumstantial evidence. How on earth can someone assess whether a given cause was in and of itself sufficient to result in ending a life without first identifying the relevant act and establishing its precise nature? Having thus skated over the principle of causation, he then facilitates the establishment of intent, the mental or volitional element to any offense against the person, and most crimes in fact, by detaching criminal intent from motive. I quote the report. He told the jury they also did not need to be certain of any motive for deliberately harming a baby. End report quote. Is this anything less than giving jurors a green light that it is okay to address the required principle of criminal intent by the ready-made explanation that the defendant is just evil? Okay, that pretty much covers what Goss told the jurors by way of legal direction on June the 15th. As previously stated, in my next video, I will pick things up when he next addresses them on July the 3rd. The period between was filled by the closing statement of the prosecution, followed by that of the defense. So, feel free to share your own thoughts and anything you think might be of interest in the comment section below. As usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.